So we zoomed out a little bit so that we can discuss our motivating operations and how important those are when we talk about reinforcement, okay? So motivating operations, there's two main parts of motivating operations. There's their effect on behavior and their effect on the value of a reinforcer, all right? So let's start off with the term motivating operations. We can make it into a SAFMED card. So on one side you're going to have your term, motivating operation. In parentheses you can also put MO because that's how we refer to motivating operations a lot. And so we can say that a motivating operation is the internal process or desire of an individual that changes the value of a reinforcer or changes the behavior. Okay, so now that we have that, let's talk a little bit about those value changes and those behavior changes, okay? So the change that occurs within the reinforcer, there are two specific things that can happen, kind of similar to our negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement. There's also two paralleling or mirroring operations that occur with motivating operation or MOs. So these are what we call establishing operations or abolishing operations. Okay, so I'm going to write these up here for you. Might be easier if I do it in terms of we have our MOs, motivating operations, right? And then on one side, we have our operations. And then on the other side, we have our effects. Okay. So, within our operations, all right, we can have an abolishing operation, or we can have an establishing. And these sometimes are done the same way that this acronym is for motivating operations, and that this would be AO, and then this one would be EO. Okay? Alright, so let's talk a little bit about our operations first, prior to going over to our effects. Alright? So remember, our operations are how our motivating operation changes the value of a reinforcer. Okay? So with our abolishing operation, we can say that the operation or the motivating operation, some stimulus can change the value of our reinforcer. Okay? So with abolishing is reducing or lowering the value of a reinforcer. Remember we talked last time about our plus is kind of one way that we can use a symbol for reinforcement, okay? Just do R so it won't confuse you. Value of a reinforcer. Establishing is something that increases the value of a reinforcer. All right, so now I'd like for you to take a second and make 2 more SAFMED cards for these 2 terms. An abolishing operation, AO, and an establishing operation, EO, in terms of increasing the value of a reinforcer or decreasing the value of a reinforcer. Okay, now let's go over to effects. And once we go through effects, we'll talk about why this is so important to changing behavior in general. And then we'll discuss a few examples, okay? So now effects. Just like with our operations and negative and positive reinforcement, we have 2 symmetrical pieces to this. So the effects are discussing the behavior change, okay? So over here we talked about the value change. If it increases or decreases the value of our reinforcer. Over here we talk about the change of the behavior. Does it increase or decrease the behavior, okay? So again, kind of similar to abolishing. We have something called an evocative effect. Okay. The evocative effect decreases the future probability of behavior. And the other one is what we call an evocative effect. This does the opposite of evocative, and it increases the future probability of behavior. I want to ask you to make a SAFMED card for these because it's very similar to negative and positive reinforcement, and you don't need to know them as much as you do about the operations. But notice how similar they are, right? But the biggest difference between the 2 is 1, this is the effect on behavior. 2, this is the effect on the reinforcer, the value of the reinforcer. How likely is this going to motivate my individual? to create behavior change. Okay? All right, great. So this is kind of an overall of our motivating operations and how those work specifically. So let's talk about why motivating operations is so important. So when someone obviously refers to MOs, we're talking about motivation, right? We're all engaging in behavior because we're motivated to do so for some reason. Depending on what those reasons are, one person might be more motivated to do something compared to another, right? So this is why it's so important for us to get to know this topic, especially when we're working with people with disabilities or children with autism, right? Because children with autism lack the typical motivation, as well do some people with developmental disabilities. So it's that lack of motivation or desire to please that can cause a child with autism to not exhibit behaviors many typical children do. So some of these things might be pointing to objects, trying to get your attention to look somewhere, that joint attention, making eye contact with you and smiling, having great reciprocal interactions with them, using communication effectively, right? Making requests. Instead, it's easier for them just to scratch you when they want to get away instead of using their words, because that's the easiest way to get you to back off, right? And the list kind of goes on and continues from there. But as you can see, those motivators are incredibly important to us when we're considering why a behavior is occurring and then how we might be able to create behavioral change, whether we want to increase a behavior or decrease a behavior, okay? Children with autism often need extra motivation to perform tasks and abilities that typical children don't enjoy, or that typical children will perform to please someone else. So, for example, birthday parties are fun and exciting, and the average child doesn't need extra motivation to attend one, right? But for a child with autism, birthday parties can be stressful, loud, super chaotic, and overstimulating. So, in order to get a child with autism to go to the party, it might be necessary to provide extra motivation. If you have a good understanding of MOs, or motivating operations, it can be a powerful tool to make anything, any stimulus, any reinforcer more motivating to the individual you're working with, okay? So motivation is key with all aspects of life. Teachers often use highly motivating environments for their students, using visual supports within their classroom, using exciting curriculum units, things that are kind of self-initiated by students, right? There's a lot of research that goes into some things like, Montessori type curriculums that really revolve and center around self-initiated areas of interest, because kids are going to learn so much more if it's something that they're motivated by. Using certain multimedia materials to increase motivation. I know that kids typically these days, if they have to write reports or things, they much rather do research on the internet, right, rather than going to the library. Or such as showing a movie about a book after, hopefully, kids have had the opportunity to read it, but that increases their motivation to learn the curriculum. So once we